So these examples are a lot of fun to look at, especially in relationship to your assignment for this week. And here we'll stay pretty focused around similar themes of simplification, limited color palette, and zones of recession. So our first example comes from Noma Bar, this great poster referencing the movie Jaws. We can see some obvious connections to simplification, showing just what's necessary to communicate the visual idea. And limited color palette, where we're literally looking at just one color plus black and white in this image. I really like what's going on here in terms of zones of recession. So what's in the foreground, middle ground, and background. And this image is kind of doing two things at once. At first glance, it might seem like there's just one figure on top of the orange ground, and it's the shark. But then you see that there's the silhouette of a foot here in the mouth. So maybe there's a foot that's in front of the shark, or maybe the shark and the foot are on the same plane. Hopefully not. But we get some really nice back and forth with the negative and positive space there. Let's move on to Francisca Borzea to get some great examples of simplification, removing extra details that are not necessary to communicate an idea, as well as a limited color palette. So you can see here we have maybe just 4 or 5 colors, along with some nice repetition of forms. And some similar things going on here in this image. Let's move on to artist Ness Lee. So this image gives us some really interesting play with what's going on in the space. We have these snakes kind of moving through the background grid, and it makes you kind of question whether or not that's sort of rigid physical sort of fencing or netting, or just kind of metaphysical sort of fantasy background. So the way the image is layered here, among other things, gives us a really interesting effect of space, as well as the way that the figures are relating to one another in the image. And we're staying on theme with this next one from Joohee Yoon. Again, thinking about simplification, limited color palette, and working within those constraints to still make an image that's pretty interesting and engaging and expressive. So I think that's done very successfully here. And same thing with this example. Now, moving on to an artist like Daiana Ruiz, you can see that there's a lot of the same things going on in terms of simplification and limited color palette, but you may notice it's rendered a little bit more realistically than some of the other images. So in terms of focusing on simplification and limited color palette, that doesn't mean that you have to draw something that's cartoony or exaggerated or stylized. You can approach this assignment with a range of styles within those simplification and color palette constraints. We can see that in our last example from illustrator Laura Szumowski, who makes these images of cultural and political icons that are very simplified and just a little bit stylized, but still very realistic.